Yeah, I'm a scientist. I have spent decades learning science and math, statistics, everything from quantum mechanics all the way to environmental science, biogeochemistry. I'm interdisciplinary. I was a tenured full professor at the University of Ottawa, and I always spoke my mind, and that got me fired. This was before COVID, so I knew what it was like to fight the establishment. And when I heard the COVID propaganda, I knew immediately that it was intense propaganda and that it couldn't possibly be true because they were yelling that we were all going to die and I couldn't see any dead bodies out in the street. And I did. I went out in the street and I looked around. I couldn't see any dead people, no matter what they said. And as a scientist, what I decided to do was to look at all-cause mortality data. So our nations collect very good data about the number of deaths. That's something you cannot be biased about. The person either died or they didn't. You know that they died, you know their age, you know where they died, and you collect that data. Countries collect very good data about deaths and births. So that is unbiased, hard data. We can analyze the number of deaths as a function of time, by age group, by sex, and by region, by jurisdiction, by province, state, down to municipalities and so on. And that is the data that I've been using since the very beginning of this so-called pandemic. And my research group, we were the first to say, back in an article that was published in June of 2020, that when we look at all-cause mortality data, there is no pandemic. There was a peak of deaths at the beginning in certain hotspots that was directly due to how people were treated in hospitals and care homes. It was quantitatively due to that. There is no, so I can tell you, after 3 years of intense study that we are continuing, I can tell you the following thing. And this is hard scientific conclusions from looking at the data. There was no pandemic. There was no particularly virulent pathogen whatsoever. There's no evidence for it. There is nothing that is spreading that causes death. The mortality doesn't cross borders. The virus has a passport. It refuses to cross borders. You can make a map of Europe. You can see countries where there's absolutely no excess all-cause mortality, right beside hotspots where there's intense all-cause mortality. So those are firm conclusions from I have written more than 30 scientific reports about all-cause mortality and COVID-related science, and I can tell you these things with certainty. So when Eva says there's no global warming, I also study global warming. I did the calculations, the radiation transfer. I can tell you Eva is right. As a scientist, I can tell you there's no global warming, there was no pandemic, nothing is spreading, nitrogen is not a problem, cow farts are not a problem. I can tell you these things with certainty. I'm not joking. I'm a scientist. The article about radiation transfer and so-called global warming that I wrote in 2010, parts of it were read in the U.S. Senate. It was very impactful. Scientists have said this is rigorous, this is hard. What I showed in that calculation was you can double the amount of CO2 and it will not have a noticeable effect on the Earth's mean surface temperature, period. That's a hard calculation. So I've been doing this for many years. Every time there is a problem in society where science can be of some help, I get right in there and I do it. And so we have done this for COVID. We were the first to establish the points that I just told you about, and then we moved on to the vaccines. And what we found was that the vaccines are a toxic substance. They should be interpreted and thought of as a toxic substance that they inject into your arm. The best way to understand the effect of the vaccine is to study toxicology. So we showed that as soon as a booster is rolled out to a particular age group, very rapidly, within weeks, immediately there follows a peak in all-cause mortality. And we see this repeatedly in country after country. We have studied more than 100 countries now, and the vaccines are clearly temporally associated with peaks in all-cause mortality. And we're able to calculate the toxicity of that vaccine, and we find that the risk of dying per injection increases with age, and it increases exponentially with age, and your risk of dying per injection doubles every 4 or 5 years of age. We were the first to demonstrate that. We have demonstrated it repeatedly for many countries, Australia, Israel, Peru, many countries. And so in this study, one of the things we found, and this should convince anybody, the following thing. We can quantify excess mortality, whether or not there's mortality beyond the historic trend, as a function of time. And what we find is that in more than half of the countries around the world, there is absolutely no excess mortality in the entire period from the time the pandemic was declared in March of 2020 all the way to until mortality starts to increase when the vaccines are rolled out. In more than half the countries in the world, there's no excess mortality until the vaccines are rolled out. And then there is a significant shift to a domain of higher mortality. And this is clear in the data itself. And the countries that do have excess mortality before you roll out the vaccines, it can be directly associated to how people were being assaulted. And there are many ways in different jurisdictions that people were assaulted. Some of the assaults were very vicious. Like in Peru, they actually called in 10,000 military reservists to go and test people in their homes, in the villages, everywhere, and pull them out and isolate them if they tested positive. They actually had a huge peak of mortality related to that policy. So when you assault people by refusing to treat them, in the US they refused to treat poor people for bacterial pneumonia by not prescribing antibiotics. This was a huge problem, a big killer in the US, and it created a peak of all-cause mortality in the summer, which is unheard of. Normally, mortality is lower in the summer. So we just kept seeing these features, and we kept explaining them quantitatively in terms of how populations were assaulted. So this was a mega campaign. Obviously, you know, it was planned by the CIA, the military. It was executed. They were going to do it no matter what. And it killed people by how they treated people. And then the vaccines themselves are toxic. So the experiment's been done globally. We know this now. We know that death increases exponentially with age. Many elderly people died. It's hard to complain because they were elderly, but still, they died. So just to give you one quantitative figure to leave you with, in most countries, people over 80, the risk of dying per injection is 1 death in between 5 and 20 injections, depending on the country. That's the level of toxicity of the vaccine for elderly people. And this is not to mention all the serious harms that are done to young people and young adults, including myocarditis, heart conditions, you name it. So this has been the nature of our scientific work. We're continuing this full time. We'll be publishing papers in the coming months that are even more revolutionary, I would say. And so we're not going to stop, and we're embarrassing the establishment scientists who are not doing this work and who are lying through their teeth and who are part of the propaganda industry. That's our job. Thanks.